She sat in the corner booth of one of Boston's most expensive restaurants for 45 minutes, watching Sin, the door, watching her phone, watching the ice melt in her untouched glass of sparkling water, and slowly, quietly, understanding that he wasn't coming. Dinah Pruitt had known, somewhere in the calcified part of her that had learned not to hope too loudly, that something was off. She'd known it the way she knew everything, through careful observation, through the small inconsistencies that most people missed because they weren't paying attention. She was always paying attention. It was the only survival skill she'd ever been good at, but she had talked herself out of it. She had stood in a bathroom at 6 o'clock that evening. In a burgundy wrap dress she'd driven 40 minutes to find in her size. In a dress that cost more than her weekly grocery budget, with her dark hair pinned back in a way that made her feel, for approximately 10 minutes, like someone worth looking at, and she had told herself, "Stop it. Just go. Just try." The restaurant was called Vesper. It occupied the top floor of a converted 1920s building in the Back Bay, all dark walnut and candlelight, and the kind of soft jazz that costs extra. The maître had looked at Dinah when she arrived alone, and given her a smile so thin it barely qualified as facial movement. He'd seated her in the back corner, near the kitchen, where the lighting was worst. She hadn't said anything. She never said anything. Her date's name was Brendan Cole. They'd matched 6 weeks ago on a dating app that marketed itself as being for accomplished professionals seeking meaningful connections. Brendan had a photo with a golden retriever. He'd remembered things she mentioned in passing, her love of crossword puzzles, her dislike of cilantro. He called when he said he would. He texted good morning without prompting. He had told her, in a voice that sounded entirely sincere, that he'd spent his whole life looking for a woman with actual substance. Not just a pretty face, he'd said. Someone real. Dinah was 31 years old. She worked as a forensic accountant for a mid-sized firm in downtown Boston, which meant she spent her days finding the precise moment where numbers stopped telling the truth. She was exceptional at her job. She was also, in the parlance of every dating app algorithm she had ever encountered, plus size, a word that covered, she had long ago observed, a complicated range of human experience that the apps reduced to a single checkbox. She'd checked the box honestly. Brendan had not seemed to mind. It was now 7:48. She had sent one message at 7:15. "Hey, just checking in. Still on?" It had been read at 7:16. No response. The waiter, a young man with an apologetic face and the name tag reading Kevin, came by for the third time. "Can I get you anything else while you wait?" Dinah looked up. She had always been good at keeping her face very still. "I think I'm done waiting," she said. "Just the sparkling water and the bread, please." Kevin nodded with the practiced neutrality of someone who had seen this exact situation before and was deeply sorry about it. He walked away. Dinah reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. 2 texts from her co-worker Renee, asking how it was going. 0 from Brendan. She blocked his number with 3 taps, set her phone face down on the tablecloth, and pressed her fingertips flat against the cool white linen. 6 weeks of 7 a.m. texts. 6 weeks of phone calls that ran long because neither of them wanted to hang up. 6 weeks of "I can't wait to finally meet you in person." And then she'd bought the dress, a whole week's worth of telling herself she deserved it, and skipped lunch because she'd been too nervous to eat, and driven 40 minutes in traffic, and sat in this corner near the kitchen, and watched the door. And he had simply decided not to come. She didn't cry. The grief was too thorough for crying. It had already calcified into something harder. Dinah picked up her purse. She would pay for the water and the bread she hadn't touched, and she would walk out through the front door, and she would stop at a drive-through on the way home, and she would eat French fries in the car in the parking lot of her apartment complex. And none of it would feel like enough, but she would do it anyway, because she was very good at enduring things that weren't enough. She was reaching for her coat when the restaurant went silent. Not the gentle, wave-like silence of a lull in conversation. This was a different kind, instantaneous, total, and physiologically alarming, the kind that made every animal instinct in the human body fire at once. The jazz stopped mid-phrase. The ambient hum of silverware and ice and light laughter cut out as though someone had flipped a switch. Dinah's hand froze on her coat. Across the room, the maitre d' had gone the color of old chalk. He was stepping backward, slowly, away from the entrance. Not turning his back the way you didn't turn your back on certain kinds of things. 4 men walked through the front door. They weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They moved with the patient, synchronized economy of people who had never once in their professional lives needed to raise their voices. Their suits were charcoal. Their hands rested at their sides in a very specific way that Dinah, who had studied enough financial fraud cases to understand the architecture of organized crime, recognized immediately. And then the man behind them walked in. Dinah had reviewed enough Shell Corporation filings, enough ghost LLC structures, and layered real estate transactions to know the name Ciro Mancetti, the way an oncologist knows a particularly aggressive tumor, by reputation, by the shape of the damage it left. Head of the Mancetti operation, which had spent the last 2 decades quietly routing money through Boston's port, its commercial real estate, its private equity firms. The federal government had tried 4 times. 4 times, the witnesses had recanted or relocated or disappeared. The FBI had a whole task force. The task force had nothing. In photographs, the few that existed, he looked powerful but distant, the way very dangerous things often did in photographs. In person, he was something else entirely. He was tall, not performatively tall, not the kind of height that announced itself, just the kind that reorganized the space around him without effort. His hair was dark, cut close, with the first threads of silver at the temples that made him look not older, but more deliberate. He had the face of someone who had made 1,000 difficult decisions and found all of them easy. His eyes, when they swept the room, were a dark, flat gray, the color of the harbor in January. He wasn't looking for trouble. He'd already found it, catalogued it, and filed it away. One of his men stepped forward. His voice was conversational, which somehow made it worse. "Ladies and gentlemen, Vesper is closed for the evening for a private event. Please leave through the kitchen. Leave your things. Do not use your phones." The room emptied with a speed that Dinah found almost impressive. Wealthy Bostonians in their 50s and 60s scrambled out of their chairs like they were 22 again, moving with a hustle she suspected most of them hadn't managed in decades. No one argued. No one asked about the check. 2 women left behind their handbags entirely. Dinah didn't move. It wasn't bravery. It was the particular paralysis of someone whose nervous system had simply maxed out. She had already exhausted her allotted distress for one evening on Brendan Cole, and her body had nothing left to spend on a new emergency. Within 90 seconds, the restaurant was empty, except for the kitchen staff, pressed against the far wall, the 4 suited men positioned at the exits, and Dinah Pruitt, sitting in the back corner by the kitchen, in her burgundy dress, with her untouched bread basket. Ciro Mancetti turned. His eyes moved across the empty room with the thoroughness of someone taking inventory, and then they found her, and they stopped. He walked toward her. His shoes made no sound on the hardwood. His men didn't follow. They held their positions at the perimeter, which told Dinah that he'd assessed her and decided she didn't require backup, which was either very good or very bad. He stopped at her table. He looked at her, really looked, the kind of direct, assessing attention that most people deflected from because it was too much. Dinah held very still and looked back. Without asking, he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He looked at the empty seat she'd been guarding for 45 minutes, at the single water glass, at the untouched bread. "You're the auditor," he said. His voice was low, precise, with the faint remnant of a coastal accent that had mostly been smoothed away. Dinah blinked. I'm sorry. The auditor. He said it again, patient, watching her face. The woman Brendan Cole said would meet him here tonight. The name landed like a stone dropped into standing water. You know Brendan, she said. It came out very flat. Something moved in his eyes. I employed him until 36 hours ago, when I discovered that $42,000 in operational accounts had been restructured through a series of sub-entities he controlled, and then quietly redirected. He paused. He told my people he was meeting his contact here tonight. A woman, someone with access to the documentation he'd been building. Dinah stared at him. The pieces assembled themselves the way they always did for her, quickly, mercilessly, without sentiment. Brendan wasn't a software consultant from Cambridge. Brendan was a money man for the Mancetti operation. Brendan had known, for the last 6 weeks, that Ciro Mancetti's people were closing in, and Brendan had needed a distraction, a reason to be at a public restaurant, a witness, a person sitting visibly at his table, so that when the surveillance footage was reviewed, it would look like a date, look like nothing, buy him time to move whatever he'd been building. He'd used her. He'd spent 6 weeks constructing a person, attentive, warm. I love a woman with substance, and used that person to make Dinah Pruitt drive 40 minutes in traffic and sit in a corner by the kitchen and wait. The anger arrived so fast and so completely that it briefly whited out every other thought. That absolute. Dinah stopped. Started again. Her voice was very controlled, but her hands were pressing flat against the tabletop, and she was aware, distantly, that she was doing this in front of one of the most dangerous men in New England, and she could not bring herself to care. 6 weeks, she said. 6 weeks he texted me every single morning. He remembered my crossword subscriptions. He told me. She stopped again, because she would not say the rest of it out loud to a stranger. I drove 40 minutes. I bought a dress I couldn't afford. I skipped lunch because I was too nervous to eat. She looked up. Her eyes were dry and her jaw was set, and she felt, for one clean, clarifying moment, absolutely nothing except fury. And he wasn't even real. Ciro Mancetti looked at her. He had expected an accomplice. He'd expected a woman who would crumble or deflect or reach for her phone the moment she recognized his face. He had not expected this. Someone who, upon processing that she was sitting across from a man whose name cleared federal waiting rooms, had bypassed fear entirely and landed directly in white-hot indignation about a dating app fraud. He's not at the restaurant, Mancetti said finally. He set the reservation, gave us the location, and didn't come. Of course he didn't come, Dinah said. He never was. She dug into her bag and pulled out her work badge and set it on the table between them. I'm a forensic accountant at Aldridge and Park on Tremont Street. I do compliance work for healthcare networks and municipal contractors. I met Brendan Cole on a dating app 8 weeks ago. I have never in my professional life touched anything connected to your organization. And if you would like to verify that, you are welcome to my firm's website, my LinkedIn, my tax returns, and a reference from my direct supervisor, who is named Patricia, and will be very irritated to be called on a Thursday evening, but will absolutely confirm that I am who I say I am. There was a silence. Behind Mancetti, one of his men, a broad-shouldered figure with a scar along his jaw, stepped forward. Boss, she's clean. Dead end. Mancetti didn't look at him. He was looking at Dinah, at the work badge on the tablecloth, at the way she'd laid it down, not thrown, not trembling, just placed, like evidence submitted to a court. He looked at the empty breadbasket, at the single glass, at the 45 minutes of solitude she'd accumulated in this corner. You were his alibi, Mancetti said quietly. He needed a reason to be at Vesper. He needed someone visible, someone who looked like a legitimate reason. He paused. He knew we were watching him. He put you in the seat so we'd see a date, not a meeting. Yes, Dinah said. Her voice was perfectly level. I gathered, which means anyone who was watching Vesper tonight saw your face, he said. My people, and the Halloran crew, who we believe Brendan was running to. They'll assume you know something. Dina felt the cold of that settle into her slowly, the way cold water does. Not all at once, but comprehensively. I know nothing, she said. You know that. I know that. The Hallorans don't. He sat back. For a moment he just looked at her, and she had the unnerving sense that he was reading something she hadn't intended to put on the page. What was your plan? After you paid your check? She stared at him. Drive home. Eat in my car. Something shifted in his expression. Not softness. Not exactly. But something adjacent to it. A recalibration. You can't go home tonight, he said. Not until we find Brendan and this is contained. I can call the police. The police won't help you, he said it without boast or threat, just the flat statement of an operational reality. Not with the Hallorans. Not tonight. Then what exactly are you suggesting? Her voice had gone very precise, the way it did when she was working through a problem she didn't like the shape of. Mancetti stood. He didn't reach for her. He just stood and looked at her and said, I'm suggesting you're not safe alone, and I'm suggesting that the man who made you sit in this corner for 45 minutes doesn't get to also put you at risk. He held out his hand. Come with me, tonight only, until this is resolved. Dina looked at his hand. She looked at the empty restaurant. She thought about her apartment, the second-floor unit, with the lock that was sometimes finicky. And she thought about the Hallorans, who she knew nothing specific about, but about whose general operational ethos she had formed a clear impression. She picked up her coat. She did not take his hand. She stood on her own. If this is a kidnapping, she said, I want that noted for the record. The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile. Noted, he said. The car was an armored black SUV with tinted windows and leather seats that cost more than Dina's monthly rent. She sat rigidly upright and watched the back bay slide past the glass, the brownstones, and the lit-up restaurant fronts giving way to the broader dark of Storrow Drive along the river. Mancetti sat beside her. He didn't speak. His presence was the kind that didn't require speech. It simply occupied the air around it and left everyone else to calibrate accordingly. Where are we going? She asked. Private building. North End. He glanced at her. You'll have your own room. You won't be disturbed. She nodded. She looked back out the window. She was still angry. A clean, hard anger that sat in her chest like a stone. And the anger was useful because it kept her from thinking too directly about the dress, about the crossword texts, about the voice on the phone that had sounded so entirely real. The building was a converted warehouse. The private elevator smelled of cedar and clean air, and it opened into a space that Dina's square footage instincts calculated at roughly 4,000 feet. Open plan, floor-to-ceiling windows facing the harbor. The lights of the waterfront spread out below like a second city built of reflections. Sit, Mancetti said, gesturing toward a grey sectional that looked like it had never been sat in. Dina sat. She put her bag on the cushion beside her. She looked at the harbor. There's food, he said. If you haven't eaten. She looked at him. I told you I skipped lunch. Then I'll have something brought up. He moved to the other side of the room, where one of his men was waiting with a tablet. They spoke in low voices. Dina watched the harbor and breathed and tried to construct a reasonable assessment of her situation. She was in the home of a man who ran a criminal operation the FBI had been trying to dismantle for a decade. She was here because a man she'd met on a dating app had spent 6 weeks pretending to like her in order to use her as camouflage. She was in a 4,000-square-foot apartment in the North End, in a dress she couldn't afford, and she hadn't eaten anything except a bread roll since 7 that morning. The anger sharpened. She let it. A woman arrived with a tray, soup, bread, a small pot of tea. She set it on the coffee table without comment and left. Mancetti crossed back to the sitting area. He took the chair across from her. Not the sectional, the chair, keeping the coffee table between them, as though he understood the geometry of her anxiety without being told. He had a glass of something dark. He looked at the tray. Eat, he said. I'm not hungry, Dinah said, which was a lie so transparent she was surprised she'd tried it. He looked at her. She picked up the soup spoon. They sat in silence while she ate. Not the pointed silence of a confrontation, but the oddly functional silence of two people sharing a space without pretense. Dinah had spent a lot of her professional life in rooms where nobody said what was actually happening, and this felt, strangely, like the opposite of that. The man on your team, she said after a while. The one with the scar. He said I was a dead end. You are, Mancetti said, professionally. And yet. He turned the glass in his hand. Brendan Cole is still out there. He has $42,000 that don't belong to him and a deal with a crew that will absolutely kill him the moment he stops being useful. He will reach out to you. Dinah considered this, because he still thinks I don't know. Yes. He'll want me to bring him something. Cover. Documents. A reason for the money to look legitimate on paper. She looked up. That's why he chose a forensic accountant, not for the date, for the access. Mancetti was looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Yes, he said again, and there was something in his voice now that hadn't been there before. You're very fast. Numbers are honest, Dinah said. People aren't. I've been calibrating for the discrepancy my whole career. He studied her for a long moment. He picked the wrong accountant. He picked someone he thought would be too grateful to look closely. The words came out before she'd decided to say them. She looked back at the harbor, a woman who'd spent 6 weeks feeling lucky, someone who wouldn't ask questions. The silence after that was different, heavier. He was wrong, Mancetti said quietly. Dinah didn't answer. She finished the soup. It was nearly midnight when her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She looked at the screen, unknown number. She looked at Mancetti. He'd been working on the far side of the room, but he was watching her now. Had been, she suspected, for a while. He crossed the room. He stood beside the couch, not crowding her, and gave a single, small nod. She answered on speaker. Dinner. Brendan's voice, and it was his voice. She'd know it anywhere after 6 weeks of phone calls, and the recognition sat in her chest like a bruise. He sounded frantic underneath the smooth, like a machine running hot. Dinner, thank God. Are you okay? You got out of the restaurant? I got out, she said. Her voice was entirely steady. The police came. It was terrifying. What is going on, Brendan? You stood me up and then, I'm so sorry. The apology came fast, practiced. There was an emergency. Work. It's complicated. Dinah, listen to me. I need your help. What kind of help? A few weeks ago I sent you a file, remember? A shared drive link. I said it was a contract template I wanted your professional opinion on. Dinah kept her face very still. She remembered. She'd downloaded it, skimmed the first few pages, standard-looking LLC formation documents. Nothing that had flagged immediately, and then gotten pulled into a deadline and forgotten about it. She had not thought about it since. I remember, she said. That file has information in it that some very dangerous people want. I need you to delete it, Dinah, from everywhere. And I need you to meet me so I can explain. Where are you? Seaport, the old parking structure on Fargo Street, level 3. His voice dropped, and something underneath the warmth finally surfaced. Something thin and cold. Don't tell anyone. Don't call the police. And Dinah, don't make me come find you. You don't want me to come find you. There it was. 6 weeks of good morning. 6 weeks of remembering her crossword subscriptions and her dislike of cilantro. And underneath all of it, this, a man who would threaten her when the performance was no longer useful, because she had never been a person to him. She had been a tool, a detail in a plan. She had been very, very carefully chosen to be exactly the kind of woman nobody would look twice at. Before she could speak, Mancetti reached down and ended the call. She looked up at him. His face was completely expressionless, but his jaw was tight in a way that hadn't been there before, a small controlled tension that told her the expression was costing him something. He stood there for a moment, then Vico. His man materialized immediately. Get the cars. Seaport, Fargo structure. He paused. All of them. Vico left. Mansetti looked back at Dinah. You don't have to come, he said. He called my phone, she said. She stood up and picked up her coat. I'm coming. The parking structure on Fargo Street smelled of concrete and salt and the particular exhausted dampness of a city that had been rained on recently. They went in dark. The SUVs pulled around the perimeter. Lights off. Dinah walked in through the pedestrian entrance alone. She'd pushed back on this. Mansetti had been immovable. He needs to see you first, he'd said. Alone. The moment he sees a car, he runs, and then he's the Halloran's problem, not mine. He'd paused, and then added, more quietly, I will be directly behind you, 15 feet. You will not be out of my sight for 1 second. She'd looked at him. I do not make promises I don't keep, he'd said. She'd gone in alone. Level 3 was dim, half the lights out, the concrete columns casting long shadows. Her heels clicked against the floor. She was aware of how loudly she was breathing, aware of the burgundy dress, aware of the fact that she hadn't eaten a real meal in 16 hours, and was nonetheless walking into a parking garage to meet a man who had threatened her on the phone. You are not the woman he thought you were, she told herself. He thought you were someone who wouldn't look closely. He was wrong. Brendan was behind the 3rd column from the elevator bank. He looked terrible. He'd lost the polish entirely. The suit was wrinkled, the hair undone, and he was holding a small black handgun with both hands in a way that suggested he didn't hold guns often. He looked at her with an expression that mixed relief and contempt in roughly equal measure. You came, he said. I came, she said. She stopped 10 feet away and didn't move toward him. You threatened me, Brendan. On the phone. You said don't make you come find me. I didn't. He stopped, recalibrated. The charm tried to come back, thinned out and unconvincing. Dinner, I'm scared. I just need the file and then I'm gone. Out of Boston. You'll never see me again. Nobody gets hurt. You got the file from me, she said. You already had it downloaded to my computer. What you actually needed was for me to delete my copy so there was no record of you sending it, and to meet you here so you could confirm I didn't share it with anyone. He stared at her. You spent 6 weeks learning my habits, she said. You knew I'd download anything you sent without much suspicion because you'd spent weeks establishing trust. You knew I had access to cloud backup systems through my firm's compliance tools. You needed to know if I'd noticed anything. You're not here for the file, Brendan. You're here to find out what I know and who I've talked to. His face changed. The last of the performance fell away. You're smarter than you look, he said, and the contempt was undisguised now. Everyone always thinks that, she said. Give me your phone. He raised the gun. Give me the phone and tell me who you talked to tonight, or I swear. She talked to me. The voice came from directly behind Dinah. Brendan's face underwent a transformation that she would, later, in the privacy of her own apartment, find deeply satisfying, a rapid sequential collapse, through confusion and recognition, and then pure, biological terror. His eyes went from Dinah to the space behind her, and whatever he saw there emptied him completely. Ciro Mansetti stepped into the light. He wasn't theatrical about it. He didn't need to be. He moved to Dinah's side and placed one hand on the small of her back. A light pressure, warm through the fabric of her coat, and just stood there, looking at Brendan Cole with an expression of absolute, total calm. Behind him, Vico and 4 others materialized from the shadows. Brendan dropped the gun. He actually dropped it. It clattered on the concrete and skidded under a car, and then his knees buckled and he went down to the ground without anyone touching him. Mr. Mansetti, he started. Boss, I can explain. The money, Mansetti said. The accounts. The Hallorans. He said each word separately, with a space between them, the way you'd read items from a list. And her. The hand on Dinah's back shifted slightly. You spent 6 weeks manufacturing a reason for her to trust you. You put her in that restaurant. You put her in the path of the Hallorans. You called her tonight and threatened her. I didn't. Brendan looked at Dinah. Something desperate and calculating flickered across his face. She doesn't work for you. She's nobody. She's just a woman I met on an app. You don't have any reason to. You're wrong, Mansetti said. He looked down at Dinah, and when she met his eyes, the grey in them was lit with something she hadn't seen there before. Something that looked like certainty, warm and completely unambiguous. She walked through the Halloran threat for me tonight. She tracked your operating logic faster than my own people did, and you spent 6 weeks making her feel like she wasn't worth looking at, so that she'd be too grateful to examine your motives. He looked back at Brendan. She was the sharpest person in every room you put her in, Mansetti said. You just made sure the rooms were dark. Dinah felt something move in her chest. She kept her face still, but she felt it. Mansetti looked at her. He's yours, he said quietly. Whatever you want. She thought about the texts. The golden retriever photograph. I love a woman with substance. She thought about the bread basket, untouched. The waiter Kevin and his careful, pitying neutrality. She thought about standing in her bathroom at 6 o'clock in a dress she couldn't afford, talking herself into trying. She looked at Brendan Cole on his knees on the concrete, and she felt, for the first time all evening, something close to peace. The full 42,000, she said, recovered and documented, and he talks. All of it, every Halloran contact, every account structure, everything on record. She paused. And then you do what you need to do. Mansetti nodded once. She turned and walked toward the exit and didn't look back when Brendan started talking. Outside, the harbor air was cold and clean, the kind that clarified things. The SUV was waiting at the curb. She stood on the sidewalk and breathed and let the clarification happen. Mansetti came out 3 minutes later. He stood beside her without touching her. He'll talk, he said. The Hallorans will be handled by the end of the week. The accounts are recoverable. A pause. You're safe. Good, she said. They stood there for a moment. The water was very dark and very still. You don't have to go back to the North End, he said. We can take you home. Dinah looked at him. He was watching the harbor, not her, and she had the sense that he was being careful, that this was him being careful, which was probably not something he did often. I know, she said. She looked at the water. But it's 2 in the morning, and my building lock is sometimes finicky, and I'm tired. She paused. One more night. He turned to look at her then. She looked back. You're extraordinary, he said. Just that. No preamble, no performance. The way he'd said everything else tonight, like a fact. You don't know me, she said. I know you ate soup without being asked twice. I know you tracked Brendan's logic before I did. I know you walked into that parking structure alone when you were terrified, and I know you didn't shake. He paused. I know you've been making yourself smaller for a long time. I know it hasn't worked because people like you don't get smaller. You just get quieter. And I know that I have spent 40 years in rooms full of people who are very loud and very empty. And you are the first person in a long time who said something that mattered. The cold air moved off the harbor. Dinah looked at the water for a long moment. Then she picked up her bag, and she walked to the car, and she got in, and she sat with her spine straight, and her hands folded in her lap, and she was not small, and she was not invisible, and the burgundy dress she'd driven 40 minutes to find caught the city lights and held them like it had been made for exactly this. Mansetti got in beside her, and the car moved, and the city opened up around them, and Dinah Pruett, who had spent 31 years learning to occupy the minimum necessary space, let herself take up the whole of the seat, and breathed, and did not apologize to anyone for it.